This is a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
Support for simple justice, suffrage in South Dakota was provided in part by American Experience, WGBH Boston, and viewers like you. Thank you.
Dakota Territory was organized in 1861 out of portions of the Nebraska and Minnesota territories. The federal enabling legislation provided for an appointed governor and the establishment of a bicameral legislature consisting of a 9-member council and a 13-member House of Representatives. The territorial legislature first convened in 1862. They filled administrative posts, drew county and voting district boundaries, and established election protocols. They first considered women's suffrage 6 years later, when a House member named Ennis Stutzman introduced a bill allowing full suffrage rights for eligible women. The 1868 suffrage proposal would have enfranchised women who were white and not married to an immigrant. If a woman's husband wasn't eligible, neither was she, regardless of race or where she'd been born. Some observers of the legislature thought the proposal was a publicity stunt or a sarcastic joke. But Stutzman had the notion that more women would move to Dakota Territory if they could vote.
There's no real evidence saying, yes, I was a woman suffragist. He was a Democrat. He wasn't a Republican. Is this something that was designed to, curry favor with the Republicans who were dominant? We just don't know.
Stutzman's bill passed the House, but didn't pass the Council. Dakota Territory's chance to become the first in the nation to recognize full suffrage for women came and went when Wyoming Territory passed a full suffrage bill in December of 1869. 10 years later, the territorial legislature considered a new full suffrage bill brought by Captain Nelson Minor of Vermilion. The 1879 bill passed the Council. The House rejected it, but gave pro-suffrage advocates a partial victory by passing a law that allowed women to vote in school district meetings.
So as women were trying to get a national amendment for full suffrage, they were getting rather frustrated because they didn't seem to be getting anywhere. So some women, mostly grassroots women, said, why don't we try something different? Why don't we get our foot in the door and see if we can convince the lawmakers to give us partial suffrage? Voting in elections was simply an extension of women's role in childhood education and did not compromise their femininity. So by making that argument, it was less threatening to the men, and it would also be a chance for them to prove their interest in voting and as good citizens.
Passage meant that as of 1879, women could also hold certain school district offices, including director, clerk, and treasurer.
So if you were in a school district, you'd go to the annual school meeting, and the people who lived there could decide who the teachers were, what they were going to tax, where the school building was, what school times were. So when that law changed, women could participate in those meetings and make those decisions.
It was over in Dakota Territory almost before it had really begun. In 1883, the legislature changed education policy and placed control of school districts into the hands of township boards. County electors chose township board members, and women couldn't be county electors.
That 1883 law was huge. It was a huge change for the way the state ran its schools, and it basically disenfranchised women. And so they had to make another law in 1887 to say, oh no, women can vote.
Women went back to voting in rural townships, but not in cities, where ballots mixed city offices with school offices. Although school suffrage for women was written into the state constitution in 1889, women still couldn't vote in cities where provisions weren't made for separate ballots. Despite those barriers, women did vote and did fill the ranks of school officials in South Dakota.
80% of the counties in South Dakota had a female county superintendent. They were seeing women in positions of leadership. They were seeing that women were in the public arena. And what had been, let's say, the unimaginable became imaginable.
The true importance of school suffrage would be revealed during the final push for passage of the U.S. 19th Amendment.
We tend to think that women only got the vote in 1920. That was the first time women went to the polls. But in point of fact, in 1900, there were 25 states where women could vote in school elections. By 1919, there were 15 million women in 32 states. I call it the forgotten piece of history, is that women had experience going to the polls. It's just that it was limited.
The people of Dakota Territory began working more vigorously towards statehood during the 1880s. When the first state constitutional convention was held in Sioux Falls in 1883, some delegates were eager to take a stand on alcohol prohibition and women's suffrage. Others felt that authorizing prohibition and full women's suffrage was dangerous. They didn't want to endorse policies that some in the U.S. Congress might consider radical or even controversial. And Congress had the last word on granting statehood.
The Congress could reject a state constitution if they didn't like its provisions, right? And so some people said, let's not, hurt our chances in any way. Let's just offer a constitution that doesn't raise the issue.
In the end, the U.S. House of Representatives rejected South Dakota's 1883 statehood petition, but the denial may have had more to do with politics than policy. Democrats controlled the House at the time, and they knew that South Dakota, with its strong Republican majority, would certainly have sent Republicans to Washington. The Dakota Territorial Legislature next considered women's suffrage in 1885. Major John Pickler of Fauq County sponsored the measure. Pickler was a Civil War veteran and lawyer who'd previously served in the Missouri and Iowa legislatures. He brought the question of women's suffrage before the Dakota legislature as a matter of pure principle. I introduced the bill really without consultation with anyone or without knowledge as to the sentiment of the members upon the question. I have had my convictions since my college days that simple justice demands that women should have the ballot, and in this opinion I am warmly seconded by my wife, who desires the vote, as I think all sensible women should. The Pickler suffrage bill passed both houses of the legislature, only to be vetoed by Territorial Governor Gilbert Pierce. Pierce said he wanted a longer debate, and he wanted a territorial referendum on the question of suffrage. Let all the men decide, rather than just the men in the legislature.
He later publicly said that he regretted the veto. When he died in 1901, Susan B. Anthony was still extremely upset about it, because as far as she was concerned, he cost women the right to vote in Dakota Territory.
The near passage of Pickler's 1885 suffrage bill was the last best hope for women's suffrage advocates in Dakota Territory.
It's a lot easier to enact women's suffrage during the territorial period than during statehood, because you don't have to have a vote. There doesn't have to be a vote. It's the legislature and the governor making the decision.
But the defeat by veto of the Pickler bill, if nothing else, ensured that the question of women's suffrage would be discussed at length during the next state constitutional convention scheduled for later that year.
You're watching Simple Justice, Suffrage in South Dakota on South Dakota Public Broadcasting. To learn more about the history of women's suffrage in South Dakota, listen to extended interviews with suffrage historians, and find links to historic photos, visit sdpb.org/thevotesd.
Oh dear, what can the matter be? Women are wanting to vote. Women have husbands, they are protected. Women have sons by whom they're directed. Women have fathers, they're not neglected. Why are they wanting to vote?
Several national and state organizations were formed and reformed during the 50-year struggle for women's suffrage in the United States. The list of regional and local organizations is long.
You need a scorecard on women's suffrage to keep track of what's going on. Likewise, you need a scorecard with prohibition/temperance. It's not always prohibition, sometimes it's temperance measures, because they're constantly, it's like, what year is it?
Some members and supporters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union were also active in the suffrage movement, but that dual allegiance among activists and the idea of linking the two issues proved to be extremely divisive over time.
And that strategy became really one of the sticking points also between the state organization and the national organization.
The list of men and women suffragists in South Dakota includes dozens of individuals from all over the state. Matilda Jocelyn Gage came to Aberdeen, South Dakota from Syracuse, New York during the 1880s. Gage was among the best-known and most radical suffrage activists of the day.
Matilda was a person who didn't like to compromise. She had her values, and she believed that human beings had inherent rights, and that it was up to her to teach the world about it.
She was an absolutist and generally unwilling to compromise her principles.
First of all, she believed in equality for all, and votes for all. And she included people of all races and religion and education levels. She included immigrants who didn't even speak English. She thought rights were rights for every human being. So that was very radical. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not think that way.
She came to Aberdeen because all of her children had moved there, believing they'd find a better economic climate than they'd enjoyed in New York.
So yeah, so she was there for 5 or 6 years for long stretches of time. And she wrote public letters to the women of what would be South Dakota, saying, let's get women into this Constitution, let's do it. She wrote to all those legislators, and that failed, and South Dakota didn't come around for quite a long time after that.
John and Alice Pickler came to Dakota Territory in 1883, staked their homestead claim, and helped found the town of Faulkton. John Pickler set up his legal practice and ran the local land office. Alice Pickler was a well-known suffragist and prohibition advocate active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union before coming to Dakota Territory. The Picklers were the power couple in South Dakota politics, but John Pickler's advocacy of women's suffrage earned him the scorn of some in the anti-suffrage, anti-prohibition camp.
He was dubbed Susan B. Pickler. And so he's being ridiculed and he's being feminized in the press because he supports women's suffrage.
John Pickler, sponsor of the nearly passed 1885 suffrage measure, was elected as South Dakota's first U.S. congressional representative. The friendship that John and Alice Pickler had forged with Susan B. Anthony during the 1880s grew stronger after they moved to Washington, D.C. Anthony also visited and stayed with the Picklers at their Faulkton home on several occasions and for several days at a time. The 1894 house is now a museum. Alice Pickler remained active in the pro-suffrage movement throughout the 1910s and lived long enough to see the passage of South Dakota's Amendment E and the U.S. 19th Amendment. Marietta M. Bones of Webster became a high-profile and controversial figure in women's suffrage politics shortly after coming to Dakota Territory with her husband, an appointed district judge. And in 1885, she formed the territory's first local suffrage organization.
She was a tall, well-dressed lady with a sweeping, businesslike air, a pleasant face, forceful gestures, and a general "I am here, make yourself at home" atmosphere about her. And I think that just really captures this woman. She was decisive, she was full of energy, and she brought all of that to her causes. And she had many causes, not just one.
Bones spoke in favor of women's suffrage at both the 1883 and 1885 state constitutional conventions, but by 1892, she was actively campaigning against women's suffrage.
She got very discouraged with the movement during the 1890 campaign when Susan B. Anthony came out here. It became a personal fight at that point. or a personal disagreement between these two women, Anthony and Bones. What Bones said essentially was, this woman has come in and she's created chaos in South Dakota in 1890. And, really, I don't think there's any question about that. Marietta Bones just said simply, this kind of management is unacceptable. And until the movement has better management, I am no longer going to participate. And of course, the movement never got better management in her lifetime.
Marietta Bones' belief in her own convictions cost her some friendships, invited lawsuits, and eventually left her on the sidelines.
People turned against her and savaged her, especially the women. The women in Webster, for example, turned completely against her. They told her she had to leave their various organizations.
Emma Smith DeVoe came to Dakota Territory with her husband in 1881.
She lived in South Dakota for about 10 years, and she was very active in a number of reform movements. She was active, for instance, in the temperance movement, which led her to become active in suffrage. And she was also very active in the statehood movement. She and her husband actually went around the state and sang songs, tried to get people interested in the statehood movement themselves, trying to get them excited about it. But in terms of suffrage, she really had a huge impact. First of all, Susan B. Anthony came and lived with her and her husband in Huron for a period of time during the campaign. Her home was actually headquarters for the South Dakota Equal Suffrage Association. So that's a huge component to the suffrage story in South Dakota.
DeVoe was an excellent speaker and a highly effective fundraiser with a style unlike other women suffragists of the day.
And she realized that you can't dress in an extreme manner. You can't look extreme. You sort of have to be mainstream to appeal to people. Otherwise, you're going to have a negative impact upon the cause that you're working for.
An economic downturn caused their business to fail, and DeVoe and her husband left South Dakota. They moved to Washington State. Emma DeVoe's suffrage work there helped secure that state's women's suffrage amendment in 1910. Mabel Ruman of Deadwood was a prominent suffrage activist in the Black Hills. She was married to Paul Ruman, one of Deadwood's founding fathers. Ruman knew that she needed a different approach and a different kind of argument for the men of the Black Hills.
Organizers, especially in the early years, saw the Black Hills as maybe a slightly different kind of population to campaign in front of. And I think that there's a number of close communities, yet they're difficult to get to. I think the economies in the hills are different, and that can affect things like fundraising and campaigning. So I do think the Black Hills suffrage campaigns probably took on a slightly different character than those elsewhere.
Several Native American women worked for women's voting rights. Jane Waldron held several state-level appointed offices and served as a secretary of her local suffrage organization.
I would say the three that I look at in my research that are very prominent are Gertrude Bonin, or Zit-Kala-Sa, the Yankton Lakota, a woman named Marie Bottineau Baldwin, who was a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Band. And then the third woman is a woman named Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who's a Wisconsin Oneida. And all three of them were very prominent on the national scene and in national Native organizations, especially the Society of American Indians.
What motivated Native women to argue for a cause that might leave them out?
They talked a lot about the treaty rights and were very concerned about land rights. And this is the moment of allotment. And land losses are just extremely high in Native communities. And for them, they were looking for any kind of tool that they could find to particularly stop that land loss, to maintain their communities, to address the really dire issues of poverty and health that their communities were facing. And so for someone like Gertrude Bonin or Zit-Kala-Sa, she sees US citizenship and the vote as a way to address some of those questions. She also sees white suffragists as possible allies.
No one had a greater hand in achieving women's suffrage in South Dakota than Mamie Shields Pyle of Huron. Mamie Shields Pyle was elected president of South Dakota's State Equal Suffrage League in 1910. She led a reorganization effort that resulted in the formation of the state's Universal Franchise League a year later.
The National, for a long time, had been urging the concentration on the vote only. This goes back decades. South Dakota was resistant to that for many years, thinking that in their own state, suffrage, they could win suffrage by promoting temperance and prohibition. The new, more modern, alignment that Pyle led was to kind of peel off that public face of supporting prohibition. The national movement had done that quite some time ago, but Pyle would then sort of come into alignment with the national movement, and the attention of the national movement, their support, I think, increased when Pyle took over.
If the men should see the women going to the polls to put down the liquor traffic, need it vex their souls. If we're angels as they tell us, can we once suppose that all the men should frown on us when going to the polls?
Arguments both for and against women's suffrage were hotly debated by delegates attending the Second State Constitutional Convention held in Sioux Falls in 1885.
Women argued that they had the constitutional right. They were human beings. They still looked to natural rights law that said, as a human being, I have the right to vote. This should not be based on gender, on whether you're a man or a woman, or sex, whether you're a man or woman. They looked to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and those ideals, those Enlightenment ideals, and that still very much resonated with them.
Kind of a progressive era mindset that we have had too much corruption, we've had too much vice, we've had too much difficulty in our political sphere, and so we need to remove that. And women, with their moral authority, are best situated to endorse and bring these kinds of reforms that we'll need. Prohibition is one of many that they're looking at.
The women who were anti-suffrage had two major ideas that militated against suffrage, I guess, if you wanted to say it that way. First of all, they believed that men and women were very different and had different roles and responsibilities in society. Nature or God, whichever you choose, or both, had created men and women differently, and they had duties to perform that were addressed by their sex or gender, as we might say more today. The thing that they argued about the most, however, or that they insisted on, was that just because men and women were different did not mean that women were somehow inferior to men. They saw the world divided into public and private in many ways, and men did the public work of defending the family, bringing in the money for the family, serving as representatives of the family. Women did the private cultural work that was very important. So they didn't take to the argument that they were slaves of men. They didn't take to the argument that they were somehow not equal. They didn't see that at all, but they did see that they were different and that was good. Women's Christian Temperance Union and the suffrage women worked together all the time. And of course, what were people to think? But if the suffrage women are working hand in hand with the WCTU, women are going to vote against liquor. So the liquor industries were very distressed about that, and they will campaign and work hard against women's suffrage as a means of protecting their business.
The decades-long policy of alien suffrage, letting non-citizen immigrant men vote if they had filed so-called first papers declaring their intent to seek citizenship, was as important as alcohol prohibition in the story of women's suffrage in South Dakota.
It's not just that women should have the right to vote because they're equal or because they love their families and can protect their homes with a vote. Those are all arguments that suffragists will use, but South Dakota has this unique context in which alien suffrage and these non-citizen voters will really captivate people's attentions, especially over time when we start to see really deep nativist sentiments build. And it's something we still see, right? Anti-immigrant, they're outsiders, we don't trust them, they're not American, we need to either kick them out or not let them in the first place. And you see that language today, and it's very similar.
The ballot questions of 1889 attracted national attention and brought the full force of the national suffrage campaign to South Dakota. Susan B. Anthony was quoted in a Washington, D.C. newspaper saying, "The state is bound by its constitution to submit the question of universal suffrage a year from this time, and we are going to concentrate all our forces in that state from this time on. We shall do the greatest work for the cause ever done. We never before had such an opportunity." For nearly a year, suffrage activists and organizers traveled the state speaking wherever an audience could be assembled. Delegates to South Dakota's final constitutional convention in 1889 upheld the 1885 amendment that required a statewide vote on women's suffrage, but they also added a proposal to authorize full suffrage for Native Americans.
It becomes sort of a conversation in the papers and among white suffragists about white women versus Indian men. You know, who's going to get the vote? And Native women kind of fall out of that equation. They don't, because they sort of cross both of those lines and those intersect, but they're not part of the conversation. It really becomes this question of pitting white women against Native men. Not all Native people wanted US citizenship and the rights, including suffrage, that came along with it, because they were arguing for sovereignty for their own nations. So in some ways it was seen as evidence that you had given up your tribal sovereignty. So many people and many tribal governments were hesitant to argue for it.
South Dakota's male voters rejected the women's suffrage amendment by 20,000 votes. The Indian suffrage amendment was also defeated. The Prohibition Amendment stood. South Dakota would enter the Union as a dry state. Under pressure from the liquor industry, the legislature asked voters to consider repealing the Prohibition Amendment in the 1889 Constitution. In 1896, the voters did just that. In 1916, the legislature referred two constitutional amendments to the men of South Dakota. One would restore alcohol prohibition, the other would recognize full women's suffrage. The Prohibition Amendment passed, the suffrage amendment failed.
And people have puzzled on that. And in many ways, it's not just that women's suffrage was maybe still a little less popular. At that point, it's this idea that we not only endorse prohibition, we endorse a broad set of reforms that will remove corruption and vice.
Pro and anti-suffrage groups had been fighting one another for decades before World War I set Europe on fire in 1914. When the United States entered the war in 1917, pro-suffragists stoked anti-German sentiments.
The messaging is very clear. These Germans do not want women to vote. And it's not just because they might not think women should vote, it's because they don't necessarily believe in the democratic process. They don't necessarily believe in American values. It's World War I. Germany and the Germans are going to become our enemies. Their nefarious plots in Europe, they're going to start bringing them to the United States.
The 1917 state legislature referred yet another women's suffrage amendment to a vote of the people in an election set for November of 1918. Amendment E was the sixth referendum on women's suffrage since 1890. The addition to the 1918 ballot of a measure that would repeal the so-called Alien Suffrage Amendment was the result of a clever political maneuver crafted by Governor Peter Norbeck. Meetings between Norbeck and Mamie Shields Pyle suggest that Pyle was more than simply aware of what Norbeck was doing.
Governor Norbeck calls the president of the league in and says, we want to change the referendum passed by the legislature in 1917. We want to add a clause to it that also makes citizenship the main qualification for voting.
And he takes this women's suffrage bill and he adds a clause. And he says, so the bill reads now, women can vote, right, this first part, and anyone who is voting on this alien suffrage clause, anyone who has not completed the naturalization process, the full 5-year process, they cannot vote. And so what's fascinating to me is it changes everything about this campaign. It's not just about should women vote and the various reasons why. It is we should have good citizens who are loyal and patriotic and true. And so it is not necessarily really at all, it's not really about women's suffrage. It's about let's disenfranchise these German traitors.
It's not unusual for lawmakers to mix issues in bills they refer to a public vote, but South Dakota voters have rarely, if ever, been offered such a stark contrast at the ballot box. South Dakota's male voters approved a women's suffrage amendment to the state constitution in 1918. The U.S. Congress approved the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution on July 4, 1919. When the time came to vote on ratifying the 19th Amendment, something happened here that had never happened before regarding women's suffrage. The vote to ratify was unanimous. South Dakota became the 21st state to ratify the amendment on December 4, 1919. The amendment was certified on August 26, 1920. Simple justice had been achieved, but it wasn't equal justice.
The 19th Amendment did not enfranchise all women. We also have to acknowledge that. It enfranchised white women. It did not enfranchise women at the time who were married to immigrant men who were not naturalized. They could not vote because their citizenship was derived from their husbands, so they could not vote. It did not enfranchise African American women who were facing the same discriminatory practices that African American men faced in a number of states and places that made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to vote. Indigenous communities, many women could not vote under the 19th Amendment. So it's not perfect, right? I think if we create this sort of mythic image of suffrage, we miss the realities of it. So we have to live, I think, in both of those worlds, where it's that it did something that mattered deeply in a legal and political sense, in terms of gender and ideas of women's role in a political participatory democracy. But of course it didn't do everything. And so then we figure out, what do we do with that? What do we make of that, right?
Voting rights for the Native American men and women left behind by the 19th Amendment weren't authorized until 1924. But after Native Americans got the vote, many ran into the same kinds of barriers set up to disenfranchise African Americans in the South.
Some of the techniques are very similar to the Jim Crow laws in the South, literacy tests and things like that. Some of the techniques really use the relationship to the federal government that Native people have, that special trust relationship, as an excuse for why they can't vote in those states.
It's difficult to say if South Dakota's newly enfranchised women voters had an immediate impact on state politics. 3 years after women got the vote, Gladys Pyle, the daughter of Mamie Shields Pyle, became the first woman elected to the State House of Representatives, where she served until 1927. Pyle served as South Dakota's Secretary of State from 1927 to 1930. She became the first woman elected to represent South Dakota in the U.S. Senate in 1938. She was elected to fill the vacancy left by Peter Norbeck, who died while in office. Stephanie Herseth Sandlin became the first woman to represent South Dakota in the U.S. House of Representatives. Her grandfather had served as governor and her grandmother as Secretary of State. Her father had been a state senator.
So I remember feeling so honored and so grateful that late night when it became clear I had squeaked out a victory in the special election and traveling to Washington for my swearing in, and thinking about all of the women who had helped me. All of the women who had gone before, like Gladys Pyle, like my grandma Lorna, but the women who I had observed and who helped me even in my formative years in high school and college, that served in the state legislature, Judy Olson Duhamel from Rapid City, Pam Nelson from here in Sioux Falls, but also Mary McClure from Redfield, near where I grew up, women on both sides of the aisle, but then all of my peers across generations of women all over the state, along the ideological spectrum, who helped organize and work so hard to help me get there, to represent women in South Dakota, to offer that voice, to break that glass ceiling. It was an extraordinary time, an extraordinary moment.
Kristi Noem, who succeeded Stephanie Herseth Sandlin in the U.S. House of Representatives, was elected as South Dakota's first woman governor in 2018.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote here in South Dakota and across the country. I am so incredibly grateful for those who did the work to ensure that we all get the chance to vote and participate.
Kristi Noem is one of 9 women governors in office in 2020. Women occupy nearly 24% of the seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and 26% in the Senate. Women have made great progress in the American political arena, but the issue of legal and social equality for all women remains unresolved worldwide. The first attempt to add an Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was made in 1923. The ERA was hotly debated during the 1970s, but widespread enthusiasm in favor of the amendment slowly faded. Now, 50 years later, some of the same inequalities that existed in the 1920s still exist.
There continue to be barriers for women candidates in fundraising. There continue to be barriers to women even choosing to become candidates and putting themselves out there for voters to consider. The research bears out that women still need far more encouragement and encouragement from other women to make the decision to run. And I would say it's also evidenced by where we are in the top office, right? Whether it was Carly Fiorina in the 2016 Republican primary in a crowded field, or a number of similarly talented women in the Democratic field in 2020, some of whom I served with, Kirsten Gillibrand and Amy Klobuchar, who still didn't make it to the nomination.